Aurora had always felt like an outsider among her people. The elves of Meridian were graceful and peaceful, content to live in harmony with the forests and mountains that surrounded their settlements. They built their homes from living wood and shaped stone with gentle hands. They sang songs that made the wind dance and the rain fall soft and sweet. But Aurora was different. Since childhood, she had looked up at the night sky with hunger in her heart. She wanted to explore the stars. She wanted to see worlds beyond the green valleys and crystal lakes of her homeland. Her parents had been kind but worried. They encouraged her to study the ancient texts and learn the ways of magic that her people had mastered over millennia. But Aurora found herself drawn more to the stories of the old days, when elves had ruled the stars themselves. Legends spoke of brave warriors who had ridden dragons across the cosmos and had fought against darkness itself. Those stories made her blood race and her fingers tingle with excitement. By the time Aurora reached her 20th cycle of years, she had become restless and frustrated. The Elf Council had decided that her generation should focus on peaceful pursuits. They had banned the ancient martial traditions and had forbidden anyone from studying the old warrior ways. They said that combat and violence were things of the past, and that Meridian had no need for warriors anymore. But Aurora could not ignore the voice inside her that screamed for action and adventure. It was during this time of growing tension that the Empire came to Meridian. Their ships descended from the clouds like dark metal birds, enormous and terrifying. The soldiers who emerged wore armor that gleamed in the sunlight and carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. Their commander was a tall human named Marcus Venn, and his eyes were cold and empty of emotion. He stood in the center of the main elf settlement and announced that Meridian was now part of the greater empire and would follow imperial law. The Elf Council had gathered to meet with Commander Venn. Aurora was allowed to observe from the back of the chamber, hidden among the older elves. She watched as the council members bowed and scraped, offering tribute and promises of cooperation. Marcus Venn smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had already won before the battle even began. He announced that all magical research would be monitored by imperial scientists. He declared that the elf population would be required to provide workers for imperial projects. He said that any resistance would be met with swift and overwhelming force. Aurora felt her hands clench into fists. She wanted to stand up and scream at the council for their weakness. She wanted to challenge Commander Venn and tell him that Meridian would never truly surrender, but she remained silent and hidden, knowing that speaking out would only result in her being silenced or worse. So she watched and listened and let the anger build inside her like a storm waiting to break. That night, Aurora could not sleep. She walked through the elf settlement under the light of the twin moons, her mind churning with thoughts and possibilities. She found herself drawn toward the forbidden path that led to the ancient dragon caves. This path had been sealed by the council generations ago, after the last dragon had disappeared into the deep places of the world. All elves were instructed never to venture in this direction. The punishment for disobedience was exile from the community. But Aurora no longer cared about the rules and restrictions that the council had placed on her. She stepped over the chain that marked the boundary of forbidden territory and walked into the darkness beyond. The path wound through dense forest and rocky terrain. Strange flowers that glowed with soft purple light lit her way. She could smell the ancient earth and feel the weight of history pressing down on her from all sides. After what seemed like hours of walking, Aurora reached the dragon caves. The entrance was massive, carved into the side of a mountain that rose so high its peak was hidden in clouds. The opening was as wide as a river and as tall as 5 elves standing on top of each other. Strange markings covered the stone around the entrance, written in a language that Aurora recognized from the oldest texts but did not fully understand. The symbols seemed to represent power and protection and warning all at the same time. She hesitated at the entrance. Her heart was racing and her breathing came in quick, short gasps. This was real now. This was not just a fantasy or a dream. She was actually about to break one of the most sacred laws of her people. She was actually going to enter the dragon caves, a place where no elf had ventured in more than 1,000 years. But as she thought about Commander Venn and the Empire and the slow death of her people's freedom, she took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness. The cave was vast beyond anything she could have imagined. Her footsteps echoed off the stone walls and seemed to come back at her from every direction. The smell of ash and sulfur grew stronger with every step she took. Deeper into the mountain, she could hear sounds that might have been wind or might have been something breathing. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness, and she began to see faint glimmers of light reflected off crystal formations that jutted from the walls and ceiling. Aurora had brought a light stone with her, one that glowed with soft blue luminescence. She held it out before her as she walked. and the light pushed back the darkness just enough for her to see the path beneath her feet. The cave walls began to show strange markings and paintings. Ancient elves had left records here of their time with the dragons. She saw images of dragons flying through stars. She saw pictures of great battles and also pictures of dragons healing wounded people and teaching them wisdom. These were not monsters. These were beings of nobility and strength. Deeper and deeper she went into the mountain. The air grew warmer as she descended. She could feel heat radiating from somewhere far below. The light from her stone grew brighter, as if responding to the increasing magical energy in the air. She realized that she was getting close to something important, something powerful. Her whole body was tingling with anticipation and fear mixed together. Then she heard it, a sound that was not quite sound, but something that existed in her mind and in her bones at the same time. It was a voice, ancient and slow and filled with infinite patience. The voice came from somewhere ahead in the darkness, and it spoke words that she understood not through her ears, but through her spirit. The dragon was calling to her. The dragon knew she was here. Aurora walked toward the voice, no longer afraid but drawn forward by a compulsion she could not resist. The cave opened up into a vast chamber, a space so large that her lightstone could not reach the far walls. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above her head, and there, coiled in the center of the chamber, was a dragon. It was enormous, far larger than she had imagined any creature could be. Its scales were deep crimson, almost black, but they seemed to contain swirling patterns of darker red deep within them. Its eyes opened slowly and fixed upon her with an intelligence that was unmistakable and almost overwhelming. The dragon did not move. It simply looked at her, and Aurora looked back. She felt as though she were being measured and judged and evaluated all at the same time. This ancient being had lived through countless ages and had seen empires rise and fall. It had watched worlds change and peoples transform. And now it was looking at her, a young elf woman who had barely lived 20 cycles of years. She wondered what it saw when it looked at her. Did it see weakness or potential? Did it see foolishness or bravery? Slowly, Aurora walked toward the dragon. With each step, she expected to hear a roar or feel the heat of fire. But the dragon remained still and silent. She walked until she was close enough to reach out and touch the dragon's face if she stretched her arm. The heat radiating from the creature was intense but not painful. It felt like standing near a blazing fire on a winter night. She could feel the dragon's breath, warm and carrying the scent of ancient spices and minerals from deep within the earth. She raised her hands slowly and placed them on the dragon's scales. The moment her skin touched the creature, everything changed. A rush of sensation flooded through her consciousness. She saw images and felt emotions that were not her own. She experienced memories that spanned thousands of years. She saw the birth of the dragons and the formation of Meridian, and the glory days when elves and dragons had ruled the stars together. She felt the loneliness of the dragon as ages passed and the elf people forgot their ancient companions. She experienced the hope that had kept the dragon waiting through the long centuries, the hope that one day an elf would come to the caves with courage in their heart and truth in their spirit. When the connection finally faded and Aurora became aware of her own mind again, she was on her knees beside the dragon's head. Tears were streaming down her face and she was shaking with the intensity of the experience. The dragon lowered its massive head and touched its snout gently to her shoulder. In that moment, a bond was formed between them, something ancient and powerful and unbreakable. The dragon made a sound then, a rumbling growl that reverberated through the entire chamber and seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. But it was not an angry sound. It was a sound of recognition and acceptance. It was the sound of a dragon greeting a new rider for the first time in more than 1,000 years. Aurora looked up at the gray. The dragon's name was Ember. Aurora learned through the bond that connected them. The creature was over 3,000 years old and had been sleeping in the caves for the past 400 years, waiting for someone worthy to bond with. Through their connection, Aurora could feel Ember's emotions and memories as clearly as if they were her own. The dragon remembered flying through the stars when the universe was different and younger. It remembered elves who rode upon its back and sang songs of power and magic. It remembered battles against dark forces and journeys to worlds that no longer existed. For 3 days and 3 nights, Aurora remained in the caves. She learned how to communicate with Ember through the bond, how to send thoughts and receive them back. She learned the dragon's history and its dreams and its hopes for the future. In return, Ember learned about Aurora. The dragon experienced the world through her eyes and understood her frustrations with the council, and her hunger for adventure and her anger at the Empire's invasion. Ember told her, through images and feelings shared across their connection, about a second dragon that lived deeper in the caves, This other dragon was smaller and younger, only 1,000 years old, with scales the color of emeralds and eyes that held the green of spring forests. That dragon had also been waiting, searching through the bond network for an elf who could hear its call. Aurora realized that she might not be alone in this. Perhaps others among her people had the gift to bond with dragons. Perhaps she was the first to answer the call, but she would not be the last. On the morning of the 4th day, Aurora rode Ember through the tunnels of the cave system toward the deeper chambers. She sat on the dragon's back, her hands gripping the warm scales behind the creature's neck. The sensation was exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. The dragon moved with grace and power. Its wings folded against its body as it navigated the narrow passages. They emerged into another vast chamber, even larger than the first, and there Aurora saw the second dragon. Verdant was the name that came to her through the bond before Ember spoke the name out loud in its deep, rumbling voice. The green dragon was perhaps half the size of Ember, but no less magnificent. Its scales seemed to shimmer and change color as light played across them, shifting from deep forest green to bright spring green to almost golden green depending on how the light hit. When Verdant saw Aurora, the dragon's eyes opened wide and a sound like the calling of bells filled the chamber. Verdant rushed forward and circled Aurora, its movement quick and playful and full of joy. The young dragon had been alone for centuries, and the presence of someone new who could understand it through the bond was overwhelming in its happiness. Aurora laughed as Verdant nudged her gently with its snout and made chirping sounds that echoed through the caves. This dragon had a different personality from Ember. Where Ember was ancient and wise and patient, Verdant was enthusiastic and curious and playful. The two dragons clearly had a deep bond with each other, but they were very different beings. Aurora spent another week in the caves, learning about Verdant and helping the younger dragon understand the modern world. Through the bond, she shared memories of the elf settlements and the forests and the cities that had grown in the centuries since Verdant had last traveled the surface. She showed the dragon images of the Imperial ships and explained the danger that now threatened Meridian. Verdant became focused and determined. This dragon was ready for action. This dragon wanted to protect the elves and save the world from the Empire's control. But before they could do anything, Aurora knew they had to prepare. She and the two dragons practiced together, learning how to move as one unit. She taught them to understand her commands and her intentions through the bond. In return, the dragons taught her to feel their power and to channel it through her own will. She discovered that through the bond, she could access a fraction of their magical strength, just enough to amplify her own abilities and give her powers that normal elves did not have. When Aurora finally left the caves, more than a month had passed. The outside world seemed strange and small to her now. She had been carrying such enormous power and wisdom in her mind that returning to the normal elf settlement felt like trying to fit a vast ocean into a small cup. She knew that she could never truly go back to the way things were before. The Imperial forces had expanded their control in her absence. They had taken over several key locations in the settlement and had begun recruiting elf workers for their projects. Several elves had disappeared, either taken by the Empire or having fled into the forest to hide. The Elf Council was in despair, meeting constantly but seeming unable to make any real decisions or take any real action. Commander Ven visited the settlement regularly, making demands and growing more aggressive with each visit. Aurora knew it was time to act, but she had to be careful. The Empire did not know about the dragons. If the Council found out what she had done, they might try to stop her. Worse, they might try to negotiate with the Empire by revealing the existence of the dragons, so she told no one. She kept her bond with Ember and Verdant secret, hidden even from her closest friends and family. She began leaving the settlement regularly, telling people she was going to meditate in the forest for spiritual renewal. No one questioned this, as meditation and spiritual practice were respected traditions among the elves. But instead of meditating, she was flying on the backs of dragons, soaring above the clouds and learning to move through the air with speed and grace. She was learning to trust Ember's instincts and to feel the wind beneath the dragon's wings as if it were her own body flying. During these flights, Aurora began to understand the true scope of the Empire's forces on Meridian. She saw military installations that had been hidden from the elf settlements. She saw weapons platforms being assembled in hidden valleys. She saw supply ships arriving regularly from other conquered worlds. The Empire was not just occupying Meridian. They were preparing to make it a major hub for their expansion into this sector of space. She knew that the time for action was coming soon. The Empire was growing bolder and more aggressive. Commander Ven had announced that all elves would be required to provide workers for a massive construction project that would take years and would probably result in the destruction of ancient forests and sacred elf sites. The Elf Council was preparing to accept these terms, too afraid to refuse. One night, Aurora made a decision. She was going to reveal herself and her dragons to Commander Ven, but she was not going to do it as a supplicant or as someone begging for mercy. She was going to do it as a warrior and a leader. She was going to show the Empire that Meridian was not a world they could conquer and control. She was going to teach them that some things in the universe could not be subjugated or broken or forced into obedience. She called to Ember and Verdant through the bond, and they came to her without hesitation. The two dragons had been waiting for this moment. They had been preparing themselves mentally and spiritually for this confrontation. They knew what was about to happen, and they were ready. Aurora climbed onto Ember's back, and Verdant flew beside them as they rose into the night sky, climbing higher and higher until they were above the clouds. The twin moons shone down on them, and Aurora looked out across the landscape of her world. She could see the lights of the elf settlements below, and the larger lights of the Imperial installations in the distance. She could feel the power of the two dragons beneath and beside her, vast and ancient and magnificent. She could feel the connection that bound them together, three beings from different species united by purpose and trust and mutual respect. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the Empire would learn that they had made a terrible mistake in coming to Meridian. Tomorrow, Aurora would show them that they had awakened forces they did not understand and could not control. But tonight she simply flew with her dragons, feeling the wind and the freedom and the hope that this moment would bring to her people. She knew there would be danger and pain ahead, but she also knew that she was not alone. She had allies more powerful than any Empire's weapons. She had friends who would stand beside her no matter what came. The dawn came early to Meridian. The sky turned from black to deep purple to pink and finally to brilliant gold as the sun rose above the mountains. Aurora watched the sunrise from the highest peak on the island, with Ember and Verdant resting on the rocky slopes around her. She had not slept during the night. Instead, she had used the time to meditate and to strengthen the bond with her dragons. She wanted to be as prepared as possible for what was about to happen. Through the bond, she could feel Ember's ancient wisdom and calm acceptance of fate. The old dragon had lived through many trials in its long existence, and it approached this day with the steadiness of a being who had seen worlds change and empires rise and fall. Verdant, on the other hand, was practically vibrating with excitement and nervous energy. The younger dragon wanted action and could barely contain its enthusiasm. Aurora stood and walked to the edge of the peak. Far below, she could see the main elf settlement and beyond it, the Imperial military installations. She could see the soldiers moving about their daily routines, unaware that this day would be the last normal day they would ever experience. She could see Commander Ven's headquarters, a large building built in the center of the settlement, from which the commander issued his orders and conducted his business of occupation and control. She took a deep breath and reached out through the bond to both dragons. She sent them her decision and her plan. Ember responded with approval and ancient strength. Verdant answered with enthusiasm and eagerness to begin. Together, the three of them stood at the peak and looked out over the world below. Then Aurora climbed onto Ember's back, settling into position behind the dragon's neck. She reached back with one hand and touched Verdant on the head, and the green dragon made a sound of understanding and readiness. They launched themselves into the air from the peak. Ember's massive wings spread wide, catching the morning breeze and sending them upward in great spiraling circles. Verdant took a different path, flying lower and faster, drawing attention from the settlement below. Aurora could already see people pointing upward and shouting. Alarms began to sound from the military installations. The Empire had not expected this. They had thought Meridian was a peaceful world with no defenses against their superior technology. Ember climbed higher and higher, with Aurora clinging to its back, the wind rushing past her face and making her eyes water. Through the bond, she could feel the dragon's confidence and power. This was what Ember had been born to do. This was the purpose the dragon had been designed for by nature itself. They soared above the clouds, and Aurora looked down to see the world spread out beneath them like a map drawn on green silk and blue water. Then the weapons began to fire. Imperial soldiers on the ground had deployed anti-aircraft systems, and energy beams shot upward toward the flying dragons. Aurora felt no fear. Through the bond with Ember, she could sense when the attacks were coming. The dragon twisted and turned with impossible grace, dodging the energy beams by distances measured in mere inches. Verdant did the same, flying in erratic patterns that made it almost impossible for the Imperial gunners to track and aim. The first real test came when the Empire launched their fighter craft. Sleek metal ships rose from hidden hangars, their engines burning bright with the flames of advanced technology. They were fast and maneuverable and equipped with weapons designed to destroy other spacecraft. They moved in formation, trying to box in the dragons, trying to trap them and eliminate them. But they had never faced anything like Ember and Verdant before. Ember dove down rapidly, faster and faster, the wind roaring around them like a living thing. Aurora held on tight, trusting completely in the dragon's control and skill. At the last possible moment, Ember pulled up sharply and released a burst of flame toward the pursuing fighters. The heat was so intense that it melted through the armor plating of the lead fighter. The ship spiraled out of control and crashed into a valley below. But there were more fighters. They kept coming, wave after wave of them. Verdant engaged several of them at once, dodging and weaving and using its own breath weapon to disable or destroy the attacking craft. Some of the fighters managed to land glancing blows against the dragon's scales. But the ancient armor of the dragons was far more resilient than anything the Empire's weapons were designed to penetrate. The battle raged across the sky above Meridian, and the elves below watched in amazement and wonder. They had thought their people were weak and helpless before the Empire's technology, but they were seeing something they had not believed was possible. They were seeing their ancient protectors, the dragons of legend, returning to defend them. Word spread rapidly through the settlement, and elves who had been hiding began to emerge from their homes, looking upward and feeling hope kindle in their hearts for the first time since the occupation began. Commander Ven, watching from his headquarters, understood quickly that the situation had escalated beyond his ability to control. He sent out an urgent communication to the Imperial capital, requesting immediate reinforcements and a weapons platform that could engage targets in the upper atmosphere. He knew that the dragons were powerful, but he believed that enough firepower directed at them simultaneously would overcome any resistance. The Empire had conquered hundreds of worlds. It had never encountered anything it could not ultimately destroy. But what Commander Ven did not understand was that the dragons were not just physical beings. They were creatures of magic and ancient power, beings that had existed long before technology had been developed and refined to the levels that the Empire had achieved. Through the bond with Aurora, the dragons could feel and interpret magical energies in ways that made most of the Empire's weapons ineffective. The soldiers firing the weapons were skilled and trained, but they were fighting blind against enemies they did not understand and could not predict. After nearly 3 hours of aerial combat, the Imperial fighters were in full retreat. Several had been destroyed. Others were crippled and falling from the sky. The surviving craft pulled back toward the military installations, signaling their need for immediate repairs and refueling. Commander Ven realized that he could not defeat the dragons with the forces currently on Meridian. He needed to wait for reinforcements. But Aurora was not going to give him that option. She communicated with Ember and Verdant through the bond, and the three of them formed a plan. It was time to show the Empire the full extent of their power. It was time to make them understand that Meridian was not a world they could casually occupy and exploit. Ember and Verdant descended toward the main Imperial installation. The weapon stations on the ground attempted to track them and open fire, but their shots were slow and clumsy compared to the dragon's speed and agility. Verdant took the lead, diving directly at the massive weapons platform that dominated the center of the installation. The dragon's emerald scales flashed in the sunlight as it moved faster and faster, approaching the platform with obvious intent. At the last possible moment, Verdant released a blast of pure magical energy from deep within its body. The energy cascaded across the weapons platform like an invisible wave, and every electronic system on it shut down simultaneously. The platform went dark and silent, its weapons frozen in their current positions, its sensors blind, its power systems fried beyond immediate repair. Ember followed up by targeting the fuel depot and ammunition storage facilities. The dragon unleashed a controlled burst of flame that was precision itself. The fire targeted only the enemy's storage areas, leaving the barracks and medical facilities untouched. Explosions rippled across the installation as fuel and ammunition ignited and burned. In minutes, the military installation had been transformed from an operational base to a smoking ruin. Commander Ven stood in the wreckage of his headquarters, watching the destruction around him. For the first time in his military career, he was experiencing something he had never felt before: true defeat. Not the temporary setback that could be overcome with enough firepower and determination, but the complete and utter defeat that came from facing something beyond your ability to comprehend or overcome. He received a message then, transmitted directly from Aurora through a combination of magical and technological means. She was asking him to meet with her to discuss terms. She was willing to negotiate. She was not interested in causing unnecessary death or destruction. She simply wanted the Empire to withdraw from Meridian and leave her people in peace. Commander Ven made the decision to meet with her. There was no point in continuing resistance. The Empire would eventually send reinforcements, but that would take time. And by then, who knew what other defenses the elves and their dragons might have prepared? It was better to retreat now with some dignity and salvage what remained of the operation. As the sun began to set on that momentous day, Aurora stood before Commander Ven in the ruins of the installation. Ember and Verdant rested on the ground behind her, their great forms silhouetted against the red and orange colors of the setting sun. She was small compared to the dragons, barely visible against their massive bodies. The negotiations took place in neutral territory, in a clearing not far from the damaged Imperial installation. A delegation from the Imperial capital had arrived by transport ship, and they came prepared to discuss terms that would allow the Empire to save face while withdrawing from Meridian. The Imperial negotiators were professional and experienced, having handled the withdrawal from several other occupied worlds, but they had never negotiated with a dragon rider before. Aurora sat at the negotiating table with Ember and Verdant, flanking her protectively. She wore simple clothing, but carried herself with the bearing of a queen. Commander Ven sat across from her, along with the newly arrived diplomatic corps members who had been sent from the capital to assess the situation and make strategic decisions. They looked tired and stressed, clearly having been briefed about the destruction of the military installation and the loss of the fighter aircraft. The lead negotiator was a woman named Caroline Wright. She was older than Commander Ven, with gray streaking her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of decades of difficult negotiations in hostile environments. She approached the talks with professionalism and a certain weariness that suggested she had done this many times before. She opened the discussion by acknowledging that the Empire had made a miscalculation in its approach to Meridian. "We underestimated the resources and the defenses available to your people," Caroline said to Aurora. "The Empire has no desire for unnecessary bloodshed or continued conflict. If you are willing to allow us to maintain a minimal presence on Meridian for trade and cultural exchange, we would be willing to grant your world a significant degree of autonomy. You would have control over your own governance and your own resources. In exchange, Meridian would recognize the Empire as a formal ally." Aurora listened carefully to the proposal. Through the bond with her dragons, she could feel their wisdom and their guidance. Ember was ancient and had seen many empires and many negotiations. The old dragon counseled caution and wisdom. Verdant wanted to push for a complete withdrawal, wanting no Empire presence on Meridian at all. But Aurora understood that the universe was complex and that complete victory was sometimes not possible or even desirable. She made a counteroffer. Meridian would recognize the Empire diplomatically and would engage in trade relationships if those were mutually beneficial. However, no military presence would be allowed on Meridian. No weapons platforms or military installations would be permitted. The Empire could send diplomats and merchants, but the world would remain demilitarized. In exchange, Aurora and her dragons would agree not to carry the conflict beyond Meridian's borders. They would not attack Imperial ships or installations elsewhere. Caroline considered this carefully. The terms were harsh but not unreasonable. The Empire would lose the military foothold it had hoped to establish, but it would maintain diplomatic relations and trading opportunities. The Dragon Rider was essentially saying that she had no interest in conquering or expanding beyond her own world. She simply wanted to protect her people and be left in peace. After several hours of negotiation, an agreement was reached. The documents were drawn up and signed by representatives of both the Empire and the Elf Council. Commander Ven and his forces would be withdrawn within 1 month. All military installations would be dismantled and removed. Trade and diplomatic relations would be established on equal terms. Meridian would become an independent world, affiliated with the Empire through formal alliance but not subject to Imperial law or Imperial rule. As the negotiations concluded and the Imperial delegation prepared to leave, Caroline approached Aurora privately. She wanted to speak with the Dragon Rider without the formal structures and protocols of the negotiation process. She found Aurora standing alone with her dragons, looking out over the valley toward the elf settlements in the distance. "You are very young to carry so much responsibility," Caroline said. "The Empire has seen many species and many kinds of power, but we rarely encounter something like this. You could have destroyed us. You could have pursued the Empire's forces beyond your borders and inflicted significant damage on our infrastructure, but you chose restraint and negotiation. That is wisdom. Aurora turned to face the older woman. She looked at Caroline's eyes and saw genuine respect there. Not fear or resentment, but actual respect. I did not become a dragon rider to conquer the universe, Aurora said. I became a dragon rider to protect my people and to preserve the freedom of my world. The Empire sought to deny us that freedom, so we had to resist. But now that the immediate threat has been removed, there is no reason for further conflict. The universe is large enough for many different peoples and many different ways of living. Caroline nodded slowly. She understood what Aurora was saying. She had spent decades watching empires expand and conquer, watching species resist and fight back, watching powerful beings struggle for dominance and control. But she had rarely seen someone who achieved power and then chose to exercise it responsibly and wisely. Most leaders, when given power, wanted more power. They wanted to expand their influence and control. Aurora seemed to be different. Before Caroline left, she offered one final piece of advice. The Empire will send observers and researchers to Meridian eventually, she said. They will try to understand your dragons and how they work. They will want to study the magic that drives them and the bond that connects you to them. My advice is to control what knowledge is shared and what remains secret. Your greatest strength is not your dragons themselves, but the fact that the Empire does not fully understand them. Aurora thanked Caroline for the warning and the advice. She understood that there would always be curiosity and interest from the Empire regarding the dragons. She and the Elf Council would need to be careful about what they revealed and what they kept hidden. Over the following weeks, the Imperial forces began their withdrawal. The military installations were dismantled piece by piece. The weapons platforms were removed. The fighter aircraft were loaded onto transport ships and carried away. The soldiers packed their equipment and prepared to leave. It was a massive undertaking, and it took considerable time to complete. During this period, Aurora worked closely with the Elf Council to help them understand what had happened and what it meant for Meridian's future. The elders were shocked by the revelation that a young elf woman had single-handedly turned back the Empire. They wanted to understand how she had done it, and what the presence of the dragons meant for their world. Aurora gathered the council in the great hall of the primary settlement. She told them the complete story of her journey to the Dragon Caves and her bonding with Ember and Verdant. She explained the connection between dragon riders and their dragons, how the bond transcended normal forms of communication and created a unity that made them far more powerful than they could have been separately. She told them about the ancient histories and the old days when elves and dragons had flown together among the stars. The council listened with a mixture of emotions. Some were angry that she had broken the ancient laws forbidding entry to the Dragon Caves. Some were amazed by what she had accomplished. Some were fearful of what it might mean if other elves began bonding with dragons. But most of them came to understand that Aurora had done what needed to be done to save their people. An old elf named Thomas, the most respected member of the council, stood and addressed Aurora directly. "You have shown us that we were wrong," he said. "We thought that peace and avoidance of conflict could protect us. But sometimes there are threats that cannot be avoided through peace alone. Sometimes we must be willing to fight to preserve what we hold dear. You have reminded us of the strength and the power that our people once possessed. You have connected us again to our ancient heritage. For this we owe you gratitude and respect." The council voted unanimously to revoke the ancient law forbidding elves from bonding with dragons. They recognized that the dragons were not monsters or demons, but ancient beings of wisdom and power, who could work in partnership with elves to protect their world and preserve their freedom. In the weeks following this decision, several other elves came to the Dragon Caves. They heard the calling of the remaining dragons, ancient beings who had been sleeping in the depths for centuries, waiting for elves worthy of bonding with them. Not all the elves who tried to form a bond succeeded. The dragons were selective and particular about who they would bond with. But gradually, a new generation of dragon riders began to emerge. Aurora became the leader of these dragon riders, the first among equals, teaching them how to work with their dragons and how to use their combined power responsibly. She was no longer just a young elf woman with a dream of adventure. She had become a legend, a guardian of her people, a bridge between the ancient past and the modern future, and though she had never sought power or authority, she had found herself called to use both to protect and preserve the things she loved. 1 year had passed since the day Aurora first bonded with Ember. The world had changed significantly in that time. Meridian was now recognized as an independent planet with full sovereignty over its own affairs. The Empire maintained a small embassy in the main settlement, but it was populated only by diplomats and merchants, not soldiers or weapons. The military installations had been completely dismantled and removed. Peace had come to Meridian, not through surrender or submission, but through strength and the willingness to defend what mattered. Aurora now spent her time traveling between the various elf settlements, teaching and helping other dragon riders learn to work with their new partners. There were now 10 dragon riders total, each bonded to an ancient dragon who had been waiting in the deep caves for someone worthy. The dragons represented a combination of ages and personalities. Some were old and wise like Ember, having slept for hundreds of years. Others were younger, having emerged from the deepest parts of the caves where they had been hiding to avoid contact with the Empire. The dragons had become integrated into elf society, though not without some adjustment and adaptation. At first, the presence of such powerful and dangerous creatures had made many elves nervous, but over time the elves came to understand that the dragons were not threats to them but protectors and partners. The dragons had no desire to harm the elves. In fact, many of them developed deep affection for the communities where they lived, protecting them from wild animals and helping with tasks that required their strength and power. The Empire's presence on Meridian, while reduced, was still significant in terms of trade and diplomacy. Aurora had established protocols for how Imperial merchants could conduct business on Meridian and how diplomats could move between the embassy and the settlements. She had become the de facto ambassador for her people. Even though she never officially accepted a title or formal position, the Elf Council still made the major decisions for their people. But they increasingly sought Aurora's counsel on important matters. One morning, Aurora stood on the cliff where her journey had begun, overlooking the dragon caves below. Ember rested beside her, the great dragon's head at a level with the cliff's edge. Verdant was flying in circles overhead, practicing maneuvers and enjoying the freedom of the open air. The emerald dragon had grown stronger and more confident over the past year, and it now spent most of its time in the skies rather than in the caves. Through the bond, Aurora could feel Ember's contentment. The ancient dragon was happy for the first time in centuries. It had feared that it would sleep for eternity in the caves, forgotten and alone, with no one who remembered the old days or cared about the history and wisdom that the dragon carried. Now it had a purpose again. It had a partner who valued it and listened to its advice. It had a role to play in protecting a world and a people that it cared about. Aurora had received a message that morning from Caroline Wright, the Imperial diplomat. The Empire wanted to offer Aurora a position as a cultural ambassador for Meridian, a role that would take her to other worlds and other settlements of the Empire. They wanted her to help them understand the dragons and to build bridges between the Empire and species that had dragons or other ancient magical beings. The offer was tempting in many ways. It would give her the adventure and the chance to see other worlds that she had always wanted. But there was a problem. If she left Meridian, her presence and her authority would be reduced. The other dragon riders were growing in power and confidence, but they still relied on her leadership and her guidance. The Elf Council still looked to her for counsel. The fragile peace that had been established was dependent to some degree on her being present to enforce the agreements and to represent Meridian's interests. She discussed the offer with Ember and Verdant through the bond. The dragons understood her dilemma. Ember, in its ancient wisdom, offered counsel. The dragon suggested that Aurora could accept a limited role with the Empire, perhaps traveling a few months of each year, while maintaining her primary commitment to Meridian. The bond between dragon and rider could sustain itself even across vast distances, as long as both parties desired the connection to continue. Verdant had a different perspective. The young dragon wanted Aurora to explore and experience the wider universe. It argued that by going to other worlds and meeting other peoples, Aurora would become a better representative for her own world. She would bring back knowledge and understanding that could help Meridian prosper and grow. Verdant believed that sometimes the best way to protect your home was to understand the larger world in which your home existed. After several days of contemplation, Aurora made her decision. She would accept the Empire's offer, but on her own terms. She would spend 6 months of each year on diplomatic missions for the Empire, representing Meridian, and working to build understanding between the Empire and species with dragons and other magical abilities. For the other 6 months, she would return to Meridian and focus on her responsibilities there. This arrangement would give her the adventure she craved while still maintaining her commitment to her people and her world. The other dragon riders understood and supported this decision. They were growing in power and authority themselves. Eleanor, a young elf woman who had bonded with a silver dragon named Storm, was developing into a strong leader. Marcus, another dragon rider bonded to a bronze dragon called Thunder, had proven to be wise and patient in conflict resolution. The dragon riders were becoming a governing body in their own right, working alongside the Elf Council to make decisions about Meridian's future. As the months passed and Aurora began her travels for the Empire, she discovered that the universe was indeed as vast and as wondrous as she had always imagined. She traveled to worlds that orbited multiple suns and experienced colors that she had never seen before. She met other species who had bonds similar to the dragon rider bond, though their companions took different forms. She encountered cultures and civilizations that had developed in isolation from the Empire, each with their own unique strengths and perspectives. She also discovered that not all was well in the parts of the Empire she visited. There were tensions and conflicts between different species. There were worlds that had been conquered and stripped of their resources. There were beings who resented imperial rule and who looked for opportunities to rebel or escape. Aurora began to understand that the universe was more complex and more troubled than the simple narrative of imperial expansion that she had been told. During one particularly revealing mission, she met with a dragon rider from another world called Karathor. This rider, a being named Sora, who was not elf or human but something entirely different, had also bonded with ancient dragons to protect their people. Sora told Aurora about how the Empire had tried to capture the dragons and use them as weapons. Only the dragons' refusal to harm the people they cared about had prevented the Empire from creating dragon riders under its control. This conversation troubled Aurora deeply. She realized that by accepting the role of cultural ambassador, she was also potentially helping the Empire understand dragons better and find ways to control them or use them for imperial purposes. She discussed this realization with Ember and Verdant during one of her regular communications with them, across the vast distance of space. The dragons' response was to trust in Aurora's wisdom and integrity. They believed that she would use the knowledge she gained to protect dragons and dragon riders, not to enable their exploitation. They encouraged her to continue her mission but to be vigilant and careful about what information she shared and with whom she shared it. Aurora made a new commitment to herself and to her dragons. She would continue her diplomatic work, but she would also use her position to identify and help other oppressed worlds and other species that had been victimized by imperial expansion. She would work to build alliances between worlds and to encourage the Empire to adopt more ethical and less aggressive policies. She would be an agent of change from within the system, a voice for peace and justice in an empire that often valued conquest and control. This new purpose gave her work greater meaning. She began reaching out to revolutionary movements on oppressed worlds and offering them advice about how to resist imperial control. She connected oppressed species with dragon riders on other worlds. She advocated within imperial circles for new policies that would grant more autonomy to conquered worlds and more representation to non-human species in imperial governance. Back on Meridian, in the 6 months when she returned, Aurora continued to train and guide the dragon riders. But she also spent time with Ember and Verdant, reconnecting with the deep bond that united them. These times were sacred to her. Times when she could set aside her diplomatic responsibilities and simply be a dragon rider again, flying through the skies above Meridian and feeling the simple joy of soaring through the air with her partners. As the years passed and Aurora reached adulthood and then middle age, her legend only grew. She became known throughout the Empire as the Dragon Rider, who had turned back the imperial occupation of Meridian, and later as the diplomat who had worked to reform imperial policies and bring more justice to the Empire's dealings with other worlds.